Hey guys. Tonight we are diving headfirst into a story so bizarre, so utterly baffling that if you were actually there, you'd probably be pinching yourself to wake up, or maybe frantically looking for the hidden camera crew. We're traveling back to the year 1518 to the city of Strasbourg for an event so peculiar it's been puzzling historians for centuries: the Dancing Plague. Imagine a dance party, but no one wants to be there, no one can stop, and the DJ is, well, apparently a very malevolent, invisible force. You might think your own dance moves are awkward after a couple of drinks, but trust me, what we're about to witness makes the Macarena look like a high art ballet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps more than you know. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment below telling me what city you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these sleepy stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alright, settle in. You're in Strasbourg, Alsace. The year is 1518 and it's July. And let me tell you, July in Strasbourg back then wasn't exactly a breezy walk in the park with an iced latte. It's hot. Not just warm, but that thick, sticky, can't-breathe kind of hot that settles over a medieval city packed with timber-framed houses, narrow cobblestone streets, and, shall we say, less than modern sanitation. The air hangs heavy with the smells of summer. Ripe fruit from market stalls, yes, but also baking bread, overworked horses, the faint tang of the river Ill, and a general miasma of closely packed humanity. You're probably just going about your day. Maybe you're an apprentice cobbler, tired of mending the same worn-out shoes, or perhaps you sell slightly questionable sausages at a street corner, swatting away flies with a practiced hand. Life is for the most part predictable. Church bells mark the hours. The town crier shouts the news, mostly about taxes probably. And the biggest excitement might be a traveling merchant with new spices or a particularly rowdy tavern brawl on a Saturday night. You're wandering down a fairly ordinary street, perhaps on your way to fetch water or deliver a message. The sun beats down, making the stones under your worn leather shoes almost too hot to touch. Dust motes dance in the shafts of light cutting between the overhanging upper stories of the houses. It's the kind of day where sensible folk seek shade, maybe doze off a bit after their midday meal. Then you see her. Her name you'll later learn is Frau Trophea. Just an ordinary woman, not a noble, not a beggar, just one of the many faces you might pass by without a second glance on any other day. But today is not any other day. She's standing in a small sun-drenched patch of the street and she starts to move. At first you might blink, thinking the heat is playing tricks on your eyes. Is she dancing? It's not a joyful jig, not a graceful sway. Her arms flail a little, her feet shuffle, a twist here, a jerky turn there. There's no music. None at all. Just the oppressive summer silence, broken only by the scuffing of her shoes on the dusty ground and her increasingly heavy breathing. You pause, a curious frown knitting your brow. Perhaps she's had a bit too much of the local wine. It's a thought. Or maybe she's had some good news, a sudden burst of untethered joy. But as you watch for a few moments longer, that initial, slightly amused thought starts to curdle into something else. Unease. Her face, when you catch a glimpse of it, isn't smiling. It's contorted, a mask of something. Strain, distress, it's hard to tell, but it certainly isn't happiness. She looks a bit bewildered, as if her own limbs have a mind of their own, a will separate from hers. One historical tidbit for you. Back in the early 16th century, public displays of extreme emotion or unusual behavior were often viewed with deep suspicion. Was it divine inspiration or something far more sinister? The line was often uncomfortably thin. She doesn't stop. Minutes stretch into an hour. She's still there under that relentless July sun. Her movements growing more frantic yet also weaker. Her dress, probably a simple linen or wool, is dark with sweat. Her hair, once neatly pinned, has come loose and clings to her damp forehead. A few other passers-by have noticed now. They stop, they stare, they whisper, "What's wrong with her?" You hear someone mutter, "Has she lost her senses?" Someone else asks, making a sign against evil. You feel a prickle of something. Not quite fear yet, but a definite sense of wrongness. This isn't a celebration. This isn't a fit of madness you've ever seen or heard of. This is something new, and it's happening right in front of you. Frau Trophäa, alone in the heat, has taken her first unwilling, inexplicable steps into what will become a waking nightmare for the entire city. You just don't know it yet. You're just watching a woman dance herself towards exhaustion, and a strange, cold dread is beginning to snake its way into the summer air. So Frau Trophäa is still going at it. The sun, that relentless celestial bully, has started its slow descent towards the rooftops, painting the narrow Strasbourg streets in hues of orange and long, creeping shadows. But she's still there, in that same dusty patch of road, her initial jerky movements now devolving into a kind of desperate, weary thrashing. You've been watching on and off for what feels like an eternity. Maybe you tried to go about your business thinking, "All right, strange lady, you do you," but something kept pulling your gaze back. It's like watching a pot about to boil over. You know it's going to happen, but you can't quite look away. And you're not the only one. What started as a few sidelong glances has now blossomed into a proper little gathering. Your neighbors, the people you nod to every morning, the ones you borrow a cup of flour from or complain about the price of ale with, are here. There's Herr Schmidt, the portly baker, his apron still dusted with flour, arms crossed over his ample belly, a frown creasing his usually jovial face. You see Frau Weber, the washerwoman, her hands, raw from lye and endless scrubbing, now clutched together at her chest, her lips moving in what might be a silent prayer or just a worried mumble. Children, initially shooed away by their parents, now peek from behind adult legs, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. This is better than any puppet show, more captivating than the town crier's loudest proclamation. The mood of the crowd is shifting. At first it was mostly curiosity. You heard the whispers. Did her husband leave her? Perhaps she found a silver coin. Maybe she's just had a bit too much of that new Alsatian wine. There was a touch of amusement, that slight, almost cruel human tendency to find entertainment in the unusual behavior of others. A few folks might have even snickered, nudging each other. You might have felt a pang of that yourself, a brief, shameful moment of, well, this is certainly a break from the monotony. But as the hours wear on, and Frau Trophäa shows no sign of stopping, that amusement has curdled. It's been replaced by a growing sense of unease, a palpable discomfort that settles over the onlookers like the evening chill. Her movements are no longer even remotely dance-like. They're spasms, uncontrolled flings of her limbs, her head lolling, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Her shoes are scuffed through in places, her feet surely bleeding. You can almost feel the burn in your own thighs, the ache in your own back just watching her. The sun is setting, and the thought of her continuing this in the dark is unsettling. Someone should do something, a woman near you says, her voice tight with anxiety. Do what? Grunts a man, probably a blacksmith by the look of his leather apron and soot-stained hands. Try and stop her? She looks like she'd bite your head off. And he's not entirely wrong. There's a wildness in Frau Trophäa's eyes now. A vacant, unseeing stare that doesn't register the crowd, the setting sun, or her own obvious distress. It's as if she's trapped in a private, terrible world, her body a prisoner to this relentless, unseen rhythm. One of the more peculiar little details that historians, or at least the chroniclers of the time, noted was the silence of the dancer. She wasn't singing or shouting or crying out, at least not in these initial stages, just the relentless percussive sound of her body against the earth and her labored breathing. This lack of vocalization, in a way, made it even more eerie. It wasn't a performance for anyone. It was an internal torment made external. The shadows lengthen and the first stars begin to prick the darkening sky. Most of the crowd should be heading home, preparing their meager evening meals, bolting their doors against the night. But they linger. You linger. This isn't just a spectacle anymore. It feels ominous, like a harbinger. A subtle shift has occurred. The initial curiosity has morphed into a kind of morbid fascination, yes. But underneath it, a seed of fear is taking root. What if this isn't just one woman's strange affliction? What if it's something else? The thought hangs unspoken in the cooling air, as heavy as the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. The strange dance of Frau Trophäa is no longer a private affair. It has an audience, and that audience is starting to feel like they're on the edge of something they can't quite name, but instinctively know is not good. The line between observer and something else is beginning to blur ever so slightly. You look at your neighbors' faces illuminated by the faint glow from a distant torch, and you see your own unease reflected back at you. This is just the beginning, you sense, and that's the most unsettling part of all. The night offers no respite. You'd think, or at least hope, that exhaustion would finally claim Frau Trophäa, that she'd collapse into a heap and the strange spectacle would be over. Maybe you even went home for a bit, tried to eat, tried to ignore the unsettling image of her relentless, silent dance. But the story, the sheer oddity of it, would have been the talk of your small household, the main topic over a meager supper of bread and soup. And sleep? Sleep would be fitful, punctuated by the imagined scuffing of shoes on cobblestones. By the next morning, or perhaps even later that first night, the situation escalates. You return to the street, perhaps drawn by an irresistible morbid curiosity, or maybe you heard the commotion from your own window, and you see it. Frau Trophäa is not alone anymore. During the night, or in the early hazy light of dawn, another person has joined her. Maybe it's a young man, someone you recognize from the market. His face now a mask of bewilderment as his legs pump and his arms swing with that same uncontrolled, jerky energy. Or perhaps it's an older woman, her gray hair flying, her movements a grotesque parody of a youthful jig. Then another, and another. It's like a terrible slow-motion infection. One by one, then in small unnerving clusters, more people succumb. They don't seem to decide to dance. You watch as someone is simply standing there, part of the anxious crowd just like you, perhaps pointing or whispering, and then their foot starts to tap. Just a little tap, then a twitch in their shoulder. Their eyes widen in confusion, maybe even terror as they try to still their own limbs. But it's no use. The invisible puppet master has new strings and more puppets. Within minutes, they too are absorbed into the writhing, pulsating mass of bodies. Panic, a cold, sharp tendril, begins to snake through the streets of Strasbourg. This isn't just one mad woman anymore. This is what? A curse? A divine punishment for some unseen sin the city has committed? Whispers fly faster than birds. It's St. Vitus's dance, someone cries, referencing a known, though still poorly understood affliction that caused uncontrollable movements, often attributed to the saint. But this feels different, more intense, more widespread. The term choreomania, from the Greek chorea meaning dance and mania meaning madness, would later be used by scholars, but right now on the streets it's just pure, unadulterated fear. You see families torn apart. A husband tries to restrain his wife, pleading with her to stop, only to watch in horror as her struggles intensify, her dance becoming more violent until he's forced to let go, lest he be struck or pulled into the macabre ballet himself. Children weep as they see their parents, people who were their anchors of stability, transformed into wild, unrecognizable figures. The social fabric of your neighborhood, once so tightly woven, is visibly fraying at the edges. The normal sounds of the city, the clatter of workshops, the calls of vendors, the laughter of children, are being drowned out by the relentless shuffling and stamping of feet, the ragged breathing of the dancers, and the rising murmur of the terrified onlookers. Imagine the scene. Not a coordinated dance, not a joyful festival, but dozens, then scores of people, jerking, twirling, leaping, often colliding with each other, their faces slick with sweat, their eyes wide and staring or squeezed shut in agony. Some are barefoot, their feet bloody and raw. Others have lost shoes, their clothes torn and disheveled. There's no music, remember, at least not yet provided by any musicians. The only rhythm is the one that seems to possess their bodies. A silent internal drummer beating a relentless, exhausting tattoo. One obscure detail that some accounts mention is that some dancers would occasionally shout out names of saints or scream incoherently, but largely it was the physical act that dominated. The fear is contagious, almost as contagious as the dancing itself seems to be. You find yourself taking a step back, then another. You clutch your children if you have them, or pull your loved ones closer. Every twitch, every involuntary muscle spasm in your own body suddenly feels suspect. Am I next? The thought is terrifying. The boundary between observer and potential victim has become razor thin. You start to avoid certain streets, the ones where the dancing is most concentrated. But the news, the rumors, the sheer visceral horror of it follows you everywhere. Strasbourg is no longer just a city dealing with a summer heat wave. It's a city in the grip of a terrifying, inexplicable epidemic of movement. The unstoppable rhythm isn't just in their feet. It's in the panicked heartbeat of everyone who witnesses it. Days turn into a week. Frau Trofea's solitary, strange performance has morphed into a full-blown crisis. We're not talking about a handful of people anymore. Estimates from the time, though notoriously unreliable for exact numbers, suggest dozens, perhaps even over 100 individuals are now caught in this relentless, exhausting dance across various parts of Strasbourg. The city, which usually functions with a certain medieval order, is starting to show signs of strain. Trade is disrupted. Workshops are quieter as apprentices and masters are either dancing or too scared to venture out, and a pall of fear hangs heavier than the summer humidity. So, naturally, the people who are supposed to be in charge, the city officials, have to step in. Imagine the scene at the Rathaus, the town hall. You've got the burgermeister, the mayor, the city councilors, probably stout, prosperous men used to dealing with tax disputes, guild regulations, and the occasional petty crime. Now they're faced with this. You can almost picture them gathered around a heavy oak table, scratching their bewigged heads or stroking their well-trimmed beards, completely bewildered. So let me get this straight, one might say, peering over his spectacles, a relatively new invention back then, by the way, and a mark of status or scholarly pursuits. People are dancing, and they can't stop, and they don't want to. Precisely, Herr Counselor, another would reply, perhaps dabbing his brow with a linen handkerchief. They dance until they collapse. Some have even expired. Yes, historical accounts do suggest fatalities from exhaustion, heart attacks, or strokes. Their initial reactions were likely a mixture of disbelief, then concern, then outright panic as the numbers grew. What do you do about something like this? There's no precedent in the city archives for spontaneous, unending citywide dance outbreak. They would have consulted physicians, of course. But medicine in 1518 was a very different beast. We're talking about a world where the theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was still the dominant medical paradigm. An imbalance in these humors was believed to cause illness, so the learned doctors of Strasbourg likely stroked their chins and proclaimed with great authority that this was probably due to hot blood. Yes, you heard that right. Their best guess was that an excess of hot blood was compelling these poor souls to jig and jive. What's the cure for hot blood, you ask? Well, according to the medical logic of the time, you need to get rid of the excess heat. One common method was bloodletting. You can imagine the scene. Hold still, Frau Müller, while I just let out some of this excessively dancy blood. It's darkly comical from our modern perspective, but back then it was serious medicine. Whether they actually attempted to bleed the dancers while they were mid-flail is, thankfully, not clearly documented, but it was definitely a theory bandied about. Other early attempts to manage the situation were probably more practical, if equally ineffective. They might have tried isolating the first few dancers, thinking it was a communicable disease in the traditional sense, but new dancers kept popping up in different locations, seemingly unconnected. They might have tried reasoning with them, shouting at them, even gently trying to restrain them. But the compulsion to move was apparently overwhelming. One can only imagine the frustration of a city guard, used to dealing with drunks or petty thieves, trying to get a group of wildly gyrating citizens to move along. Nothing to see here. The city council was in a bind. The public was scared. The church was likely starting to weigh in, with pronouncements about sin, divine wrath, or demonic possession. The pressure to do something, anything, was immense, and in their desperation, these esteemed city officials, after much head-scratching and debate, would land on a solution that, in retrospect, seems utterly, wonderfully, and tragically misguided. It's a testament to how little they understood what they were dealing with. They were, in essence, trying to fight fire with, well, more fire, or in this case, more rhythm. The chronicles from the period, like those by Irenaeus Roser or the Specklin Chronicle, detail these official responses, though often with the slightly bewildered tone of people recording something they themselves can barely comprehend. Their attempts to impose order on chaos were about to take a very strange turn. All right, so the esteemed City Council of Strasbourg, after much deliberation and probably a fair amount of communal head-desking, has landed on a diagnosis: hot blood. And with this diagnosis comes a treatment plan. If people are dancing because they have an excess of fiery energy, well then the logical, to them anyway, solution is to let them dance it all out. Yes, you heard me. Their grand idea to stop the unstoppable dancing was more dancing. It sounds like something out of a Monty Python sketch, doesn't it? He's got a terrible cough. Quick, make him smoke 3 packs of cigarettes, that'll clear it right up. But this was their considered medical and civic response. The authorities decided that if these poor souls were compelled to dance, then the most compassionate and effective thing to do was to facilitate it. Perhaps they reasoned that if the dancers could really, truly exhaust themselves in a controlled environment, the affliction would simply burn itself out. so they started to organize it. Imagine the town criers, usually bellowing about tax deadlines or lost livestock, now proclaiming new civic ordinances. Hear ye, hear ye. By order of the council, all afflicted by the dancing malady are encouraged to dance with vigor. Spaces will be provided. They cleared out guild halls, large open indoor spaces normally used for meetings, feasts, or storing goods. They even, according to some accounts, cordoned off open-air marketplaces. The corn market, the grain market, is specifically mentioned in some chronicles. Suddenly, these public spaces were transformed into designated dance zones. One rather specific and slightly mind-boggling detail that emerges from the historical fog is that they even constructed a wooden stage for the dancers, as if this were some sort of performance rather than a terrifying public health crisis. And then came the music. If you're going to have a dance-off against a mysterious plague, you need a soundtrack, right? So the city council hired musicians. Drummers were brought in to provide a steady beat. Pipers and fiddlers were enlisted to play lively tunes. The idea, presumably, was that good music might guide the bad dancing, or perhaps that a constant driving rhythm would help the afflicted to more quickly reach that point of total exhaustion. So now you have this surreal scene. In the midst of a terrified city, in these specially designated areas, scores of people are flailing, jerking, and collapsing, all to the incongruously cheerful strains of pipes and the relentless thud of drums. It must have been a nightmarish cacophony. You, as an observer, might be standing on the periphery of one of these dance halls, a mixture of horror and disbelief churning in your stomach. The music is loud, almost aggressively upbeat, but it does nothing to alleviate the suffering you're witnessing. The dancers don't look like they're enjoying the tunes. Their faces are still masks of agony, their movements still uncontrolled and desperate. The professional musicians hired to provide a cure look increasingly uncomfortable, like they're fiddling while Strasbourg burns or, in this case, dances itself to death. Some historians have debated whether this more dancing cure was purely a medical decision or if there was an element of social control involved. Perhaps by corralling the dancers into specific areas, the authorities hoped to contain the spectacle and prevent it from spreading further panic or disrupting the city's commerce too much. It's a plausible theory, trying to put a veneer of order on utter chaos. There's also the idea that in an age where public ritual and spectacle were important, transforming this terrifying outbreak into something resembling a very grim festival might have been an attempt to regain some sense of communal control over the unknown. But whatever the underlying rationale, the effect was devastating. Encouraging more dancing, providing music, and creating stages didn't cure anyone. It likely exacerbated the problem. People who might have otherwise collapsed from exhaustion in a quieter corner were now driven to keep moving by the relentless music and the sheer mass of other bodies in motion. It's like trying to put out a grease fire with water, a well-intentioned action with disastrous consequences. The city officials, in their wisdom, had essentially turned Strasbourg into a giant, involuntary, and increasingly tragic disco, and the party showed no signs of stopping. The cure was, in fact, making things demonstrably, horrifyingly worse. The more dancing cure, as you can imagine, isn't exactly yielding the miraculous results the Strasbourg City Council had hoped for. In fact, it's having the opposite effect. The constant music, the designated dance zones, the sheer spectacle of it all, it seems to be fueling the frenzy rather than quelling it. The number of dancers continues to swell. Some accounts suggest that at its peak, as many as 400 people were caught in the grip of this relentless choreography. 400 individuals twisting, leaping, and flailing day and night, under the hot summer sun or in the flickering torchlight of the guild halls. You're witnessing a city unraveling at its seams. The initial shock and fear are now compounded by a growing sense of exhaustion, not just for the dancers, but for everyone. Imagine the strain on resources. People are not working. Fields might be untended, shops shuttered. Food might be harder to come by if the bakers and butchers are among the afflicted, or if farmers are too scared to bring their goods into the city. The hired musicians, initially perhaps just doing a job, must be looking increasingly haunted, their arms aching from non-stop playing, their tunes now a soundtrack to suffering rather than revelry. How long can you play a merry jig when people are literally dying on the dance floor in front of you? And die they did. This isn't a gentle, sleepy waltz we're talking about. The dancing was violent, continuous, and utterly draining. People collapsed from sheer physical exertion, from strokes, from heart attacks. Their bodies, pushed far beyond any reasonable limit, simply gave out. You might see someone falter, their movements becoming weaker, their legs buckling. Maybe compassionate onlookers or weary family members would rush forward to try and help, to drag them from the maelstrom of bodies. But often it was too late. The cobblestones of Strasbourg and the wooden floors of its guild halls became, for some, their final resting place. One particularly grim detail from contemporary chronicles is the mention of onlookers, placing bets on who would collapse next. A bleak testament to how desensitized, or perhaps how desperate for any kind of distraction some had become. For the dancers themselves, it must have been a living hell. Imagine the agony. Your muscles scream, your joints ache, your feet are bloody and blistered, your throat is parched, but you cannot stop. It's like being trapped inside a runaway machine, your own body betraying you. There are accounts of dancers crying out in pain, begging for help even while their limbs continued to move against their will. Some in their delirium might have had visions or shouted incoherencies. The mental toll, the sheer terror of being locked in this state is almost unimaginable. Desperation starts to permeate the city like a thick fog. If the doctors are wrong and the city council's grand plan is a catastrophic failure, then what's left? People are watching their loved ones suffer and die, and they are helpless. The normal structures of society, the things you rely on for comfort and order, are proving utterly useless against this invisible enemy. You start to see it in people's eyes, a haunted, hollow look. The initial excitement or morbid curiosity of the crowds has long since evaporated, replaced by a grim, weary resignation and a growing, gnawing fear that this might never end. You might find yourself looking at your own hands, your own feet, with a new sense of distrust. What if it happens to you? What if you're next to feel that involuntary twitch, that irresistible urge to join the dreadful, unending dance? The air is thick with unanswered questions and unspoken fears. The summer days, once long and lazy, now seem to stretch into an eternity of suffering. The nights offer no relief, only the distant, maddening sound of drumming and the shuffling of countless tormented feet. The city of Strasbourg is no longer just observing a strange phenomenon. It is being consumed by it, one exhausted, desperate soul at a time. The dance floor is becoming a place of last resort, and for many, the last dance is a dance of death. The grand experiment of more dancing has predictably tanked. The guild halls are still echoing with the frantic shuffling of feet and the increasingly strained notes of hired musicians, but it's clear to everyone, from the most bewildered peasant to the most flustered city councilor, that this is not a cure. It's a catastrophe. The death toll is rising. Desperation has reached a fever pitch. So what's next on the medieval problem-solving checklist when civic and medical solutions fail so spectacularly? You guessed it, religion. When man's efforts fall short, you turn to God, or in this case, to the saints. The prevailing worldview in 1518 Europe was deeply, profoundly religious. Sickness, misfortune, and bizarre events like a dancing plague were often interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, the work of demons, or a test of faith. The church was not just a place of worship. It was a powerful institution that permeated every aspect of daily life. So naturally, the focus shifts. The city officials, having exhausted their secular ideas or lack thereof, now look to the clergy for answers and interventions. Masses are held. Special prayers are offered up in the Grand Strasbourg Cathedral, and in smaller parish churches throughout the city, you'd see processions of priests, acolytes swinging censers billowing fragrant and hopefully demon-repelling smoke, winding their way through the streets chanting litanies, imploring God and the saints for mercy. The atmosphere becomes thick with incense and piety, for the onlookers, for the families of the afflicted. These rituals might offer a sliver of hope, a sense that perhaps a higher power could succeed where human efforts had failed. You'd join the crowds, your head bowed, murmuring prayers, a desperate hope kindling in your heart. One particular saint becomes central to this new strategy, Saint Vitus. He was a Christian martyr from Sicily, and for reasons that are somewhat obscure, as is often the case with patron saints, he became associated with curing neurological disorders, epilepsy, and, conveniently enough, conditions involving uncontrollable movements, often generically referred to as Saint Vitus's dance. So, the logic was, if people are doing Saint Vitus's dance, then Saint Vitus himself must be the one to appeal to. It's like calling tech support for the specific brand of your malfunctioning soul. This leads to the idea of pilgrimages. If praying in Strasbourg isn't potent enough, then perhaps taking the afflicted directly to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus would do the trick. So arrangements are made. The dancers, or at least those who are still somewhat mobile and haven't completely collapsed, are to be taken to shrines of Saint Vitus. One such shrine was located in the Saverne, or Zabern Caves, a few days' journey from Strasbourg. Imagine the logistics of this. Transporting dozens, maybe hundreds of people who are uncontrollably dancing across miles of medieval roads. It must have been a truly surreal and heartbreaking procession. They were reportedly given red shoes, possibly as part of the ritual, or perhaps just because their own were worn through. Some were even said to have small crosses and holy water sprinkled on them during this desperate journey. But here's where things take a slightly darker, or at least more punitive, turn, reflecting the often harsh realities of the era. While prayers and pilgrimages were one approach, there was also an undercurrent of blame. If this plague was a divine punishment, then clearly someone had sinned. The community needed to be purified, and sometimes that meant identifying and punishing those deemed responsible, or at least making a show of moral correction. There are accounts, though some historians debate their complete accuracy, of the city authorities also implementing measures that were less about healing and more about moral cleansing. They banned gambling, for instance. Prostitutes were rounded up and expelled from the city. Blasphemers were threatened with severe penalties. The idea was to appease an angry God by cracking down on perceived vice. It's a classic societal response to inexplicable crisis. Find a scapegoat, or at least demonstrate your own piety through performative righteousness. You might see these new edicts posted, see the guards enforcing them with renewed vigor, and feel a mixture of relief. Perhaps this will work. and anxiety. What if my minor sins are contributing to this horror? The line between seeking divine mercy and enacting societal control was, as always, a blurry one. The city was throwing everything it had at the problem: prayers, pilgrimages, and a good dose of public moralizing. Anything to make the dancing stop. While the priests are praying, the pilgrims are trudging and dancing their way to St. Vitus's shrines, and the city council is busy trying to legislate morality back into Strasbourg. What are ordinary people like you thinking? How are you, the terrified citizen huddled in your home or watching the grim spectacle from a safe distance, trying to make sense of this waking nightmare? Because official explanations, hot blood from the physicians, divine wrath from the clergy, might provide a framework, but human nature craves more immediate, more tangible, and sometimes more fantastical reasons for such widespread suffering. The air in Strasbourg, already thick with the scent of fear and desperation, now becomes saturated with rumors, superstitions, and a wild array of folk theories. You hear them whispered in the marketplaces, those that are still functioning, murmured over flickering candles in hushed homes, and exchanged in anxious huddles on street corners. Every new dancer, every collapse, every fruitless prayer fuels the speculation. One of the most persistent whispers is, of course, about curses. This wasn't just generic divine anger. This was targeted. Someone or some group must have cursed the city or specific individuals. Was it an old woman who lived on the edge of town? The one everyone already suspected of being a witch because her cat had an unnerving stare, or her herbs grew a little too well? Had someone angered a powerful unseen entity? You might find yourself eyeing your neighbors with suspicion. Did Frau Miller say something unkind to the wrong person? Did young Hans steal something from a traveler who then laid a hex upon him? In an era where belief in witchcraft and malefice was widespread, this was a terrifyingly plausible explanation for many. The idea that a human agent empowered by dark forces could inflict such suffering was a deeply ingrained fear. Historical records from witch trials often list causing illness or strange behavior as a common accusation. Then there were the astrological explanations. Perhaps the stars were misaligned? Was Mars in a particularly aggressive aspect, or Saturn casting its gloomy influence over Strasbourg? Learned scholars and amateur stargazers alike would have been consulting their charts, looking for celestial portents that could explain this earthly chaos. The comet we saw last spring, someone might exclaim, it was a sign. Everything becomes a potential omen when you're desperate for answers. And let's not forget the more medical folk theories, existing alongside the official hot blood diagnosis. Some might have believed it was a form of poisoning. Could it be something in the water? Or perhaps the bread? Ergotism, a condition caused by consuming rye flour contaminated with the ergot fungus, is a modern theory for the dancing plague, as it can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and a burning sensation in the limbs. While the people of 1518 wouldn't have known about ergot fungus specifically, the idea of tainted food causing widespread illness was certainly familiar. You might find yourself suspiciously sniffing your loaf of bread or boiling your water with extra care. There was also the theory of overheated spirits or agitated vapors within the body, a sort of layman's version of the humoral theory. Perhaps the unusually hot summer had literally cooked people's insides, causing their vital spirits to go haywire. You might hear remedies being suggested: cold baths, if you could find enough clean water and brave the shock, or calming herbal concoctions, though what herb calms an unstoppable urge to dance is anyone's guess. The hot blood theory, though official, also took on a life of its own in the popular imagination. It wasn't just a clinical imbalance. It became a vivid, almost visceral image. People imagined their blood literally boiling, forcing them to move to release the pressure. This is where the more dancing cure, however misguided, found some intuitive if flawed resonance with the populace. It made a kind of terrifying, simplistic sense. Academic circles, or at least those individuals who considered themselves learned, were also no doubt debating these points furiously. While we don't have detailed transcripts of their coffeehouse or rather tavern debates, you can be sure that physicians, theologians, and local scholars were all offering their own interpretations, often conflicting, always delivered with an air of certainty. Historians and medical scholars still debate the precise contemporary understanding and classification of this ailment. One might cautiously state, even then acknowledging the mystery. The truth is, no one really knew, and in the vacuum of true understanding, fear and imagination ran wild, painting 1,000 different, equally terrifying pictures of what was happening to their city. The summer of 1518 wears on, each day hotter and more desperate than the last. The various cures, more dancing, prayers, pilgrimages, moral crackdowns, have all proven spectacularly ineffective. Instead of abating, the dancing plague in Strasbourg is now reaching its terrifying zenith. The trickle of afflicted individuals has become a flood. Imagine the scene not in one isolated street, but erupting in multiple locations across the city, a patchwork of writhing, frenzied humanity. Contemporary accounts, like those from the physician Paracelsus, who visited Strasbourg a few years later and commented on the event, or the various city chroniclers, suggest that at its peak, the number of dancers was truly staggering for a city of Strasbourg's size. While precise figures are, as always with historical data from this period, subject to debate, the commonly cited number is around 400 people actively, uncontrollably dancing at one time. 400. Try to picture that. Not in a stadium, not at a modern music festival, but crammed into the narrow medieval streets, the marketplaces, and the hastily repurposed guild halls. The city is in a state of near paralysis. Normal life has all but ground to a halt. The workshops are largely silent, the clatter of looms and the ring of blacksmiths' hammers replaced by the incessant, maddening scuff and stomp of dancing feet. Markets are sparsely attended, if open at all. Who has the heart to haggle over the price of cabbages when their neighbor is convulsing in the street? Fear is the dominant currency. Doors are bolted earlier, windows shuttered not just against the night, but against the horrifying spectacle outside. You would see clusters of dancers, their bodies slick with sweat, clothes in tatters, faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. They are no longer individuals. They are a collective organism, bound by this shared terrible compulsion. They bump into each other, stumble, fall, only to be pulled back up by the relentless rhythm or by others still caught in the throes. The hired musicians, if any are still playing, must be on the verge of collapse themselves, their jaunty tunes now a grotesque counterpoint to the suffering. More likely, the organized music has faded, replaced by the raw percussive sounds of the dancers themselves. Their gasps, their occasional shouts, the slap of bare feet on hot stone. The heat is a relentless oppressor. The July and August sun beats down mercilessly. Dehydration must have been rampant. Combined with the extreme physical exertion, it's a lethal combination. You'd see people collapsing more frequently now, their bodies simply giving out. Some sources mention that carts were brought in daily to carry away those who had died, their tormented dance finally over. It's a grim, sobering thought. The city authorities who once built stages for the dancers are now organizing their removal. One of the stranger and sadder details is that some dancers, in their delirium, reportedly expressed a desire to die, to be freed from this torment. The social order is fraying. Families are devastated, watching loved ones consumed by this mania, powerless to intervene. The sheer number of afflicted means that almost everyone in Strasbourg would have known someone, or known of someone who was dancing. It wasn't an abstract problem happening over there. It was immediate, personal, and terrifying. The city guards, the clergy, the civic leaders, they are overwhelmed. What can you do when faced with hundreds of people acting against their own will, in a way that defies all known medical or spiritual understanding? There's a sense of unreality to it all. If you were there, you might find yourself questioning your own sanity. Is this really happening? Are your eyes deceiving you? The world has turned upside down. The familiar streets of your city have become a stage for a macabre, unending performance. Children are terrified. The old whisper that the end of days is near. Even the most stoic and rational individuals would be shaken to their core. Historians still grapple with understanding the sheer scale of this collective phenomenon. You might hear a scholar of a later age say, and you'd nod because living through it feels like being trapped in a fever dream, from which there is no waking. This is the peak, the terrible crescendo of Strasbourg's dancing plague. The city is holding its breath, wondering how much more it can endure, and if there will ever be a return to normalcy. The dance is at its wildest, its most desperate, and its most deadly. Every fever, no matter how intense, eventually breaks. Every storm, no matter how violent, eventually blows itself out. And so it was with the dancing plague of Strasbourg. After weeks stretching into a month or possibly even longer, the exact timeline is a bit hazy as historical accounts sometimes differ, the mania began to subside. It wasn't a sudden cessation, no miraculous moment where everyone just stopped and looked around, bewildered. It was a slow, painful, and uneven fade, like a fire gradually running out of fuel. You might first notice it in the numbers. Where once there were hundreds, now there are scores. The designated dance areas, those tragic guild halls and marketplaces, are a little less crowded. The relentless energy that had gripped the city seems to be ever so slightly diminishing. You might see a dancer who had been moving with frantic intensity for days begin to slow. Their jerks become less violent, their leaps less frequent. Exhaustion, a profound, bone-deep weariness that even the strange compulsion couldn't entirely overcome, is finally starting to assert itself. Some dancers would simply collapse, not in death this time, but into a deep, almost comatose state of sleep, their bodies finally surrendering after an unimaginable ordeal. They would be carried away by family members or concerned citizens, their ordeal perhaps over, though the road to recovery would be long and arduous. Others might find the compulsion gradually weakening, the invisible puppet strings loosening their grip. They might stumble to a stop, looking around in a daze, confused, disoriented, and utterly spent. Imagine their first moments of stillness, the blessed relief but also the terrifying realization of what they had just endured. The process was sporadic. Some individuals would stop dancing while others, just a few feet away, continued their tormented movements. There was no clear pattern, no single intervention that seemed to be working universally. The prayers continued, no doubt. Perhaps some of the pilgrims returning from the shrines of St. Vitus showed improvement, leading some to credit the saint's intercession. However, it's more likely that the phenomenon was simply running its natural course, whatever that course was. One obscure theory, rarely discussed but fascinating, is that perhaps the particular batch of potentially ergot-contaminated grain that might have contributed to the outbreak, was finally used up, and newer, safer supplies were coming in. This is pure speculation, of course, but it highlights how many unknown variables were at play. As the number of active dancers dwindled, a new kind of atmosphere would settle over Strasbourg. The acute, high-pitched panic would begin to recede, replaced by a dull, aching exhaustion and a profound sense of grief. The city was like a patient recovering from a severe illness, weak, scarred, and deeply shaken. The streets, once echoing with the sounds of the dance, would gradually fall quieter, an eerie silence punctuated by the sounds of mourning and the quiet industry of a city trying to piece itself back together. For those who had been afflicted, the end of the dancing was not the end of their suffering. They would be physically ravaged, emaciated, their muscles torn, their feet perhaps permanently damaged, and the psychological trauma, unimaginable. The memory of being a prisoner in one's own body, of the pain, the fear, the public spectacle. These scars would last a lifetime. Families, too, would be dealing with the aftermath, caring for the survivors, mourning the dead, trying to comprehend the sheer senselessness of it all. The chroniclers of the time noted the subsidence. Sebastian Brandt, a humanist scholar and author of Ship of Fools, was in Strasbourg during this period, and his writings, along with others, paint a picture of a city slowly emerging from a nightmare. But they offer no definitive explanation for why it stopped. Was it the heat of summer finally breaking? Was it the interventions, however misguided, finally having some delayed effect? Or did the collective psychological state that fueled it simply exhaust itself? Historians still debate the precise factors that led to the decline of the dancing plague. You could almost hear a future lecturer in tone, and it would be true. The ending was as mysterious as the beginning. All Strasbourg knew was that the terrible, unstoppable rhythm was finally, mercifully fading away, leaving behind a city forever marked by its strange and terrifying summer of dance. The last exhausted dancer has stumbled to a halt. The eerie silence that descends upon Strasbourg is a relief, yes, but it's a heavy, wounded silence filled with unspoken grief and the ghosts of recent trauma. The summer of 1518 is drawing to a close, and as the oppressive heat finally begins to break, the city takes a collective, shuddering breath and begins to count the cost. And the cost, you realize, is immense, measured not just in lives lost, but in shattered bodies, frayed minds, and a deep scar on the communal psyche. First, there are the dead. While precise, verifiable numbers are elusive, as is common with historical records of this nature, contemporary accounts and later estimations suggest that a significant number of people did not survive the dancing plague. Some sources mention dozens, others hint at even more, succumbing to heart attacks, strokes, or sheer unrelenting exhaustion. Each death was a personal tragedy. A husband, a wife, a child, a neighbor. You would see families in mourning, their doors marked with black crepe, the sounds of lamentation replacing the frantic beat of the dance. The city's graveyards would have seen increased activity, small somber processions a common sight. It's a sobering thought, dying not from war or a recognizable pestilence like the Black Death, but from an irresistible urge to move. Then there are the survivors, the ones who danced and lived. Their ordeal is far from over. Physically, they would be wrecks. Imagine weeks of non-stop violent exertion. Muscles would be torn, joints inflamed, feet battered, bloody, and possibly infected. Some might have suffered permanent physical disabilities. The chronicler Irenaeus Roser mentioned that many were left with shaking limbs for a long time afterwards. They would be emaciated, weakened and vulnerable to other opportunistic infections in their depleted state. The road to physical recovery would be slow, painful, and for some, incomplete. You'd see them in the streets weeks later, walking with a limp, their hands still trembling. A constant, visible reminder of the madness that had gripped them. And what about the psychological toll? This is harder to quantify but no less devastating. The sheer terror of losing control of one's own body, the public humiliation, the physical agony, the delirium. These experiences would leave deep mental scars. We don't have the language of PTSD from 16th century Strasbourg, but you can be sure that many survivors suffered from what we would now recognize as severe trauma. Nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression. These would be their silent companions. Some might have been ostracized, feared by neighbors who still didn't understand what had happened and worried it might be contagious or a sign of some lingering taint. The term dancing plague itself carries a stigma. The economic impact on Strasbourg would also have been significant. For weeks, normal commerce was disrupted. Workshops were closed. Trade routes likely saw less traffic into the frightened city, and agricultural work might have been neglected. The city council had spent money hiring musicians, building stages, and then later, on caring for the afflicted and burying the dead. Guilds would have lost members, families their primary breadwinners. It would take time for the city's economic pulse to return to normal. One minor but interesting detail. Some historians suggest that events like these, by disrupting the labor force, could have subtle long-term impacts on wages and social mobility, though proving a direct link for Strasbourg is difficult. Socially, the event would have left a residue of fear and mistrust. When the inexplicable happens, people look for explanations and often for scapegoats. Had the whispers about curses or witchcraft led to any actual persecution? The historical record is somewhat murky on this for Strasbourg in 1518, but it's a known pattern in times of crisis. At the very least, there would be a heightened sense of anxiety about the unknown, a feeling that the world was perhaps less stable, less predictable than previously thought. The city officials and the clergy would also be doing their own post-mortem. What did they learn? Would they be better prepared if, God forbid, such a thing ever happened again? The event would be recorded in the city chronicles, a bizarre and cautionary tale for future generations. Yet even as they recorded it, they couldn't fully explain it. The dancing plague would remain an unsettling entry in Strasbourg's history, a testament to the fragility of human understanding in the face of the truly bizarre. The city had survived, but it was changed, quieter, and perhaps a little wiser, though mostly just profoundly bewildered. The dancing has stopped. The immediate crisis is over, and Strasbourg is slowly, painfully, trying to resume some semblance of normal life. But the story of the 1518 dancing plague is far from finished. Now begins the task of remembering, recording, and trying to understand what on earth just happened. This is where the chroniclers step in. The local historians, physicians, scholars, and even curious laypeople who felt compelled to document this extraordinary event for posterity. And as you, or rather future historians, delve into these accounts, you'll find that getting a perfectly clear, unified picture is tricky. Imagine sifting through these old documents. Some might be official city records, dry and factual, noting council decisions or expenditures related to the plague, like payments to those musicians or for the care of the afflicted. Others are personal letters, diaries, or more formal historical narratives written by individuals who were either eyewitnesses or who gathered testimonies shortly after the event. Each writer brings their own perspective, their own biases, and their own level of detail. You'll encounter names like Sebastian Brandt, the famed humanist and author of Ship of Fools, who was in Strasbourg at the time and whose writings allude to the event. There's Irenaeus Roser, a priest who wrote a chronicle, the Specklin Chronicle, compiled later in the 16th century by Daniel Specklin, also provides a detailed account, likely drawing on earlier sources and oral traditions. Paracelsus, the renowned and somewhat controversial physician and alchemist, visited Strasbourg a few years after the plague, around 1526, and wrote about it, offering his own medical theories, often dismissing those of his contemporaries. What becomes immediately apparent is that these accounts don't always neatly align. It's like trying to piece together a shattered vase. You have many fragments, but they don't all fit perfectly, and some pieces might be missing entirely. For instance, the exact start date of the plague can vary slightly from one account to another. Was it mid-July? Early July? The precise number of dancers involved is also a point of contention. Some sources say up to 400, others give vaguer descriptions like many hundreds or a great crowd. Pinning down exact figures from centuries-old narratives, often written without the modern emphasis on statistical accuracy, is a common challenge for historians. Academic historians often point to these discrepancies as a reason for caution when interpreting primary sources. You might note, highlighting the detective work involved in historical research. The duration of the plague is another area with some fuzziness. Did it last for a month? 6 weeks? Some accounts suggest it peaked in August and subsided by early September. The exact endpoint is as nebulous as the start. And what about the death toll? While most chroniclers agree that people died, the exact number is rarely stated with certainty. This isn't necessarily due to sloppy record-keeping, though that could be a factor, but also because in the midst of chaos, accurate body counts might not have been the highest priority. Then there are the interpretations offered by the chroniclers themselves. Paracelsus, for example, had his own unique theories. He dismissed the idea of Saint Vitus being the cause, or cure, and instead proposed that Frau Trophea's initial dance was a dissimulation, a deliberate act perhaps to shame or provoke her husband. He believed that others then joined in through a combination of lascivious imagination and hysterical suggestion. This is quite different from those who emphasized demonic possession or divine punishment. Each writer filtered the events through their own belief system and intellectual framework. One interesting, though perhaps minor point of divergence is how much emphasis different chroniclers placed on the official responses, like hiring musicians. Some detail it extensively, others less so. Even the very name dancing plague or St. Vitus's dance being applied to this specific outbreak is something that evolved. Contemporaries might have just called it the frenzy or the sickness. The later a chronicle is written, the more likely it is to have incorporated interpretations and labels from other, similar events or from developing medical or theological ideas. So, as you try to understand this event, you're not dealing with one monolithic truth, but with a collection of narratives, each a piece of the puzzle. There are kernels of undisputed fact. It happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. Many people danced uncontrollably, and it caused widespread distress and some deaths. But the specific details, the motivations, the exact scale, and the contemporary interpretations, these are all shaded by the perspectives of those who put quill to parchment. It's a reminder that history is not just what happened, but also how it was remembered and retold. And the conflicting accounts of the Strasbourg dancing plague make it an even more intriguing and frustratingly elusive Historical mystery. Centuries have passed since the summer of 1518. Strasbourg is a modern city, its medieval core now a picturesque tourist attraction, rather than a stage for inexplicable torment. Yet the dancing plague continues to fascinate and baffle. With the benefit of hindsight, modern science, and a different understanding of the world, what explanations can we offer for this bizarre episode? While we can't pop back in a time machine with a blood test kit and a team of neurologists, scholars today have proposed several compelling, though still debated, theories. One of the most frequently discussed candidates is ergotism. This is a condition caused by ingesting rye, or other grains, contaminated with the ergot fungus, Claviceps purpurea. This fungus produces alkaloids that can have powerful psychoactive and physiological effects. There are two main forms of ergotism: gangrenous, which affects blood supply to the extremities, and convulsive, which is characterized by muscle spasms, twitching, convulsions, hallucinations, and a sense of delirium. Sound familiar? Many of the symptoms described in the Strasbourg accounts, the uncontrollable movements, the delirium, even reports of a burning sensation some dancers felt, align pretty well with convulsive ergotism. Rye was a staple grain in that region, and damp weather conditions, which can promote fungal growth preceding a harvest, could lead to contamination. This theory provides a neat biological explanation. However, the ergotism theory isn't without its critics. Some historians and medical experts point out inconsistencies. Would an entire group of people, potentially 400 of them, all ingest a sufficiently high and similar dose of tainted rye to produce such uniform, dance-like symptoms over such a prolonged period? Ergot poisoning often causes a wider range of debilitating symptoms, not just a compulsion to dance. Also, some argue that the sheer coordination, however frantic, seen in some descriptions of the dancing, isn't typical of ergot-induced convulsions, which are usually more random. The debate among academics regarding the ergotism hypothesis is still very active. You'd often hear in discussions about the plague. It's a strong contender, but not a slam dunk. This leads us to the other major modern theory, mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. This is a phenomenon where a group of people, often under conditions of extreme stress, begin to exhibit similar physical or psychological symptoms for which no clear organic cause can be found. Essentially, it's a collective stress response. Think about the context of Strasbourg in 1518. Life was hard. Famine, disease like leprosy, plague, and the newly arrived syphilis, then called the French disease, and poverty were rampant. There was immense social and religious anxiety. The world was perceived as a place full of dangers, both natural and supernatural. In such a high-strung environment, the theory goes, the strange behavior of one person, Frau Trophea, could act as a trigger, and through suggestion, imitation, and shared anxiety, the behavior could spread rapidly through a susceptible population. The fact that the authorities, by hiring musicians and creating public dance spaces, essentially validated and even encouraged the behavior, might have inadvertently reinforced the psychogenic spread. It's like they legitimized the dance as the appropriate response to whatever was afflicting people. This theory also helps explain why it seemed to affect groups and why it eventually burned out, perhaps as the social and psychological dynamics shifted, or as the focal point of the community's anxiety changed. One curious detail that supports this is that similar dancing manias have been recorded at other times and places in Europe, particularly during periods of hardship. Could it be a combination of factors? perhaps a mild outbreak of ergotism, affecting a few individuals and causing some initial strange symptoms, was then amplified and spread through mass psychogenic mechanisms in a highly stressed population. This blended theory is appealing to some scholars as it accounts for both potential physical triggers and the undeniable power of the human mind and social dynamics. Other, less mainstream, theories occasionally surface. Some have suggested forms of encephalitis or other neurological disorders that can cause abnormal movements. However, explaining the sheer scale and the seemingly contagious nature of the dancing becomes more difficult with these purely individual medical conditions. The fact that it stopped without a clear medical cure also leans away from a simple infectious disease model as we understand them today. So, ergot poisoning or mass hysteria, or a bit of both? The truth is, we may never know for certain. We are looking back across a gulf of 500 years with limited and sometimes contradictory evidence. But these modern theories at least offer plausible frameworks for understanding how such a bizarre event could have unfolded. Moving beyond curses and hot blood to consider the complex interplay of biology, psychology, and society, the mystery of the dancing plague endures. A testament to the strange and sometimes inexplicable corners of human experience. The dancing plague of Strasbourg in 1518, while perhaps one of the most famous and well-documented instances, wasn't an entirely isolated phenomenon. As you wander further down the long, echoing corridors of history, you'll find other, similar outbreaks of what historians broadly term dancing mania or choreomania. These strange episodes, scattered across different centuries and locations, particularly in mainland Europe, suggest that Strasbourg was part of a larger, albeit poorly understood, pattern of collective behavior. These weren't your average village festivals that got a little out of hand. We're talking about episodes where large groups of people were seized by an irresistible urge to dance, often for days or weeks, sometimes to the point of exhaustion or even death, much like what you witnessed in Strasbourg. The historical record, though often fragmented and tinged with the biases of the time, paints a picture of communities gripped by these inexplicable frenzies. One of the earliest well-documented outbreaks occurred on Christmas Eve in 1021 in Kulbik, Germany. Legend has it that a group of people danced and sang so wildly outside a church, disturbing the service, that they were cursed by the priest to dance for an entire year. While the curse element is likely a later embellishment or a contemporary interpretation, the core event of uncontrollable, prolonged dancing by a group seems to be historically rooted. This highlights the frequent intertwining of such events with religious narratives and interpretations of sin and punishment. Throughout the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, particularly in the Rhine and Moselle River valleys, not far from Strasbourg, geographically and culturally, several other instances were recorded. For example, in 1278, about 200 people were reportedly seized by a dancing fit on a bridge over the Meuse River in Germany. The bridge, unable to withstand the rhythmic stomping, collapsed and many drowned. A tragic outcome and a chilling reminder of the physical dangers involved. Then, in 1374, a major outbreak swept through several towns in present-day Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Thousands were said to be affected, dancing for days, shouting, experiencing hallucinations, and traveling from town to town in frenzied processions. This 1374 event is particularly significant because it was widespread and well documented by contemporary chroniclers, providing much of the comparative material for understanding later outbreaks like Strasbourg's. What are the common threads in these historical echoes? Firstly, They often occurred during times of significant hardship and social stress. The period from the 14th to the 17th centuries in Europe was marked by recurring plagues, most notably the Black Death, which had a devastating psychological impact long after its initial waves. Famines, wars, and profound religious and social upheaval. These were anxious times, and academic historians often suggest that such collective psychogenic phenomena are more likely to erupt in populations under severe duress, as one might put it. Secondly, the behavior was often described as involuntary and agonizing, not joyful or celebratory. Dancers were tormented, exhausted, and sometimes pleaded for help or release. This aligns with the Strasbourg accounts and argues against them being simply ecstatic religious rituals that got out of control, though religious fervor often played a role in how they were interpreted and responded to. Thirdly, the contagious nature of the dancing was a common feature. Like in Strasbourg, one person or a small group would start, and then others would join in, seemingly unable to resist. This points strongly towards psychological mechanisms like suggestion and mass hysteria. Fourthly, the responses often involved religious interventions, exorcisms, prayers, pilgrimages to shrines of saints associated with healing such afflictions, particularly Saint Vitus or Saint John the Baptist. This underscores the prevailing belief that these manias had a spiritual or supernatural origin. Interestingly, these large-scale dancing manias seem to have largely faded out by the mid-17th century. Why? Some scholars suggest that with the Enlightenment, the rise of more scientific worldviews, and changes in social and religious structures, the cultural space for such phenomena diminished. The way society understood and responded to unusual behavior began to shift. Looking at these other historical instances doesn't necessarily solve the mystery of Strasbourg 1518, but it places it within a broader context. It shows that this wasn't a one-off freak occurrence, but rather a recurring, if rare, manifestation of human behavior under certain extreme conditions. The echoes of these dancing feet down the halls of history serve as a chilling reminder of how vulnerable communities can be to outbreaks of collective psychological distress, especially when facing overwhelming stress and uncertainty. The people of Strasbourg weren't uniquely mad. They were caught in a pattern that had played out before and would, in different forms, play out again. The last strains of phantom music have long since faded from the streets of Strasbourg. The guild halls have been aired out, swept clean of the tragic residues of that summer. Life, as it always does, has moved on. Generations have come and gone. Yet, the story of the 1518 dancing plague refuses to be neatly filed away in the archives of forgotten oddities. It lingers, an unsettling whisper in the annals of history, primarily because, even after 5 centuries of inquiry and speculation, a definitive, universally accepted explanation remains elusive. You've journeyed through the heat and horror of that summer, witnessed Frau Trophea's first steps, the spread of the mania, the desperate and misguided attempts to control it, its terrifying peak, and its eventual, exhausted subsidence. You've heard the contemporary whispers of curses and hot blood, and you've listened to modern scientists debate ergotism versus mass psychogenic illness. And yet, at the end of it all, you're left with a profound sense of mystery. That, perhaps, is the most enduring legacy of the dancing plague. The questions it leaves behind. Why Strasbourg? Why 1518? Were the specific social, economic, and religious conditions in that city at that particular time a perfect storm for such an outbreak? We know the period was fraught with anxiety. The Reformation was just beginning to send shockwaves across Europe. There were fears of Ottoman expansion, and the usual medieval hardships of poverty and disease were ever present. Strasbourg itself was a significant city, a crossroads of trade and ideas, but also a place where tensions could run high. Could this unique confluence of pressures have pushed its citizens over some invisible edge? Historians continue to explore the specific socio-cultural context of early 16th century Alsace to shed light on this. You might reflect, acknowledging the ongoing scholarly pursuit, and what about the nature of the experience itself? Can we truly comprehend from our modern vantage point what it felt like to be caught in that involuntary torment, or to witness it firsthand? The accounts speak of agony, of a loss of control, but the subjective internal experience of the dancers remains largely hidden from us. Were they hallucinating? Were they in a trance-like state? The chroniclers, for all their efforts, could only describe the outward manifestations. The very fact that the cure of more dancing was not only attempted, but officially sanctioned speaks volumes about the desperation and the profound lack of understanding. It's a stark reminder of how differently pre-modern societies approached phenomena that lay outside their established medical or theological frameworks. There was no CDC, no established protocol for mass unexplained rhythmic movement disorder. They were improvising, often with tragic results. Even the most plausible modern theories, ergotism and mass hysteria, have their unanswered questions and their scholarly dissenters. If it was ergot, why weren't other classic symptoms of ergot, poisoning, more widely reported? Why the seemingly organized, albeit frantic, dancing, rather than more generalized convulsions? If it was mass hysteria, what was the precise psychological mechanism that triggered such an extreme and prolonged physical response in so many people? And why did it primarily manifest as dancing specifically? These aren't easy questions to answer with the evidence at hand. The dancing plague of Strasbourg serves as a chilling case study in the vulnerability of the human mind and the sometimes thin veneer of societal order. It reminds us that collective behaviors can emerge that defy easy explanation, driven by forces, be they biological, psychological, or social, that we may not fully grasp. It's a historical Rorschach test. What you see in it often reflects your own assumptions about human nature, society, and the limits of knowledge. So the silence that lingers after the dancing plague is not a comfortable one. It's the silence of unresolved questions, of a mystery that continues to intrigue and disturb. It's the silence that prompts us to keep asking, keep researching, and keep wondering about those strange hot weeks in 1518 when an entire city was seized by an irresistible, inexplicable, and ultimately tragic urge to dance. The dancers are long gone, but their ghostly footsteps still echo, a faint, unsettling rhythm in the quiet corners of history. The city slumbers now, under a canopy of stars that Frau Trophea and her fellow dancers once gazed upon in their delirium. The cobblestones, once hot and unforgiving beneath their ceaseless feet, are cool and quiet. Imagine the soft hoot of an owl, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of trees that might be descendants of those that witnessed the strange summer. The river Ill flows on, as it did then, carrying away the city's secrets towards the sea, its gentle lapping a soothing counterpoint to the remembered frenzy. You can almost feel the exhaustion yourself, a sympathetic weariness settling deep into your bones, a welcome heaviness behind your eyelids. The questions, the theories, the unsettling images, they begin to soften around the edges, blurring into the indistinct landscape of approaching sleep. The urgency fades, replaced by a distant curiosity, like recalling a strange dream from long ago. The suffering, so acute in the telling, now feels buffered by the centuries, a sorrowful but distant echo. Let the silence of those Strasbourg nights, after the last dancer finally found rest, envelop you. There's no need to solve the mystery tonight. Some stories are meant to be pondered, to drift through your mind like clouds rather than pinned down with answers. The important thing is that you listened, you journeyed back, and now it's time for your own well-deserved rest. The city of Strasbourg, in your mind's eye, is finally at peace, and so, hopefully, are you. The full text ends here. Welcome to follow my other works. Good night.